A loyal dog's bark at his owner's funeral uncovers a hidden letter that reveals a shocking secret, unraveling a truth that will change everything for the family. What's inside the letter could alter the course of their lives forever. Don't miss the emotional discovery. Write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The sky was a dull gray, the kind of day when everything seems quiet and still. The air felt heavy, like it was waiting for something to happen, but no one knew what. People stood together in small groups, their faces sad and serious. They were all gathered in one place, a graveyard. It was a quiet place, where people came to say goodbye to their loved ones. At the center of the gathering stood a group of mourners, their heads lowered in respect. They were there to remember a man who had passed away. Some of them were crying, wiping away tears with handkerchiefs. Others simply stood in silence, as if the weight of the loss was too much to say anything at all. The air was filled with sadness, as the group came together to say their final goodbyes. The funeral service had started, and the words of the priest floated in the air like a soft prayer. His voice was gentle but firm, as he spoke of life, death, and what comes after. The mourners listened quietly, trying to understand the meaning of it all. But amidst all the sorrow, there was one creature who seemed to be watching with more than just sadness in his eyes. Sitting a little away from the mourners, just outside the small circle, was a dog. His name was Max. Max had been the man's dog for many years. He had always been there, by his side, wagging his tail, happy to be with his owner. Max's fur was a soft, golden brown, and his eyes were a deep, loyal brown. He had the kind of eyes that seemed to see everything, even if you didn't notice. Right now, though, those eyes were full of confusion and sadness. Max didn't really understand what was going on. All he knew was that his owner was gone, and no one had told him why. Max sat still, his tail tucked tightly between his legs, his head turned slightly towards the casket. It wasn't like Max to sit quietly for long. He was usually full of energy, running around and wagging his tail at everyone he met. But today, everything felt different. He had been following his owner everywhere for years, from morning walks to late-night cuddles on the couch. And now, for the first time, Max couldn't follow. His owner wasn't coming back. The dog could feel it in the air. Something was wrong, but he couldn't put his paw on what it was. As the mourners gathered around the grave, some of them said a few words. They spoke kindly of the man, remembering the good times they had shared with him, laughing softly as they recalled old stories. Max didn't really understand all the words, but he could feel the love behind them. He knew that his owner had been important to these people, and he knew that they must have loved him. Max had always known when his owner was sad or happy. He was good at reading people's emotions, understanding the little signs that others missed. But now, there was only silence. A silence that seemed to fill the air, heavier than anything Max had ever felt before. Suddenly, Max's ears perked up. A strange feeling washed over him. He didn't know why, but something told him he needed to move. Slowly, Max stood up and started walking towards the group of mourners. The others noticed him immediately, some of them smiling gently at the sight of the dog. They all knew Max, and they knew how close he had been to his owner. But Max didn't stop walking. He was heading straight toward the grave. The mourners watched as Max walked closer, his paws pressing softly into the ground. The dog seemed determined, as though he had a purpose. He stopped just at the edge of the grave, his nose sniffing the air. His eyes looked around, almost like he was searching for something. But he didn't know what. Max stood still for a moment, and then something strange happened. The dog barked. It was a loud bark, one that broke the stillness of the moment. It echoed across the graveyard, bouncing off the trees and the gravestones. Everyone turned to look at him, surprised by the sudden noise. They weren't expecting the dog to do anything, especially not bark at a time like this. The priest, who had been speaking calmly just moments before, stopped in the middle of his sentence. He looked down at Max, a little confused, but then continued with his prayer, hoping that the dog would settle down. But Max didn't stop barking. His bark grew louder, more urgent, as if he was trying to say something, trying to get everyone's attention. The mourners stood still, staring at the dog, unsure of what to do. Some of them looked at each other, exchanging confused glances. Why was Max barking like this? What was he trying to tell them? Max's bark was not a playful one. It wasn't the kind of bark that you hear when a dog sees a squirrel or wants to play fetch. It was a different kind of bark, one that seemed to come from deep within him, a bark filled with something more than just a need for attention. It was almost as if Max was trying to communicate something that none of the people around him could understand. The dog's eyes shifted from the mourners to the grave itself. His nose twitched as he sniffed the ground. There was something about this spot that seemed to call out to him. He had been here before, of course. He had watched his owner stand at the same grave, had seen the same people gather around. But now, something was different. Max could feel it in the air, a strange energy that he couldn't explain. Max lowered his head and began to scratch at the dirt beside the grave. His paws moved quickly, shoveling the soil aside as though he was digging for something. The mourners were too stunned to say anything, watching in silence as the dog continued his strange behavior. What was he doing? Why was he digging at the ground during such a sacred moment? Some of the people began to whisper among themselves, but none of them stepped forward to stop Max. It was almost as if they were waiting to see what he would do next. With every dig, the earth seemed to loosen, and soon enough, Max's paws hit something hard. His nose pressed against the ground, and he sniffed eagerly. The dog barked again, more sharply this time, as if to tell everyone that he had found something important. His tail wagged just a little, a sign that he knew he had found what he was looking for. The mourners exchanged confused looks, unsure of what to do. Some of them took a step closer to the dog, curious to see what he had uncovered. Max's paws scraped away the last of the dirt, and what appeared was something that no one had expected, a small, worn envelope. The letter was tucked into the earth, almost as if it had been hidden on purpose. Max's nose twitched as he carefully picked up the letter in his mouth. He stood up and turned, walking slowly toward the nearest mourner, his eyes wide with a strange mix of pride and curiosity. He had found something. And what it was, no one could yet know. The mourners stood in stunned silence, watching as Max carried the letter in his mouth. They were all too shocked to speak. What was this letter? Why was it buried here, at the grave of someone they all knew so well? What did it mean? Everyone could feel that something important had just been uncovered, something that had been hidden for a long time. Max sat down in front of the mourners, the letter still clutched in his mouth, his eyes looking up at them. His tail swished nervously as he waited for them to open it. It was as if he knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The mourners took a step forward, still not fully understanding what had just happened, but knowing that they couldn't ignore the strange and powerful presence of the dog, who had uncovered something that could change everything. The world felt still, as if it were holding its breath. All eyes were on Max, and on the mysterious letter he had found. At the funeral, the air was heavy with sadness. The sky was gray, as if even the clouds felt the grief of the day. People stood in silence, their heads bowed, their eyes red from crying. They had all come to say goodbye to someone they loved, someone they would never see again. Among them stood a dog, his fur matted with the dirt beneath his paws, his eyes full of confusion and sorrow. The dog was different from the rest of the mourners. He didn't understand the words being spoken or the reason everyone was so sad. He had been with his owner for many years, loyal and loving. He had always followed his owner, played with him, and been there through thick and thin. But now, his owner wasn't there. The dog's nose twitched as he looked around the gathering. Where was the person he loved so much? He sniffed the air, hoping to catch a familiar scent, but all he could smell was the heavy scent of flowers and the dampness of the earth. His tail drooped lower, and his ears flattened against his head. He didn't understand. He wanted to bark, to run and play, but instead, all he could do was stand quietly, watching the people around him. There were so many people in the crowd, all standing in rows, all saying goodbye to someone they cared about. Some of them wiped their eyes, and others just stood still, lost in their own thoughts. The dog was used to seeing people happy and full of life, but today everything felt different. There was no laughter, no games, no running. It was all still and quiet, like the world had stopped turning. As the ceremony went on, the dog felt a strange pull in his chest. It wasn't just the sadness of the moment. Something else was making him restless. He looked around the gravesite again, his paws twitching with nervous energy. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like something important was missing, something he had to do. Then, without thinking, the dog took a few steps forward. His paws pressed softly into the earth as he moved closer to the grave. His eyes fixed on the casket, the shiny wooden box that held his owner's body. The dog's nose twitched again, his heart pounding in his chest. Something inside him told him to go to the grave, to be close to it, to get as near to it as he could. The dog moved slowly but purposefully, like he was being guided by an invisible force. He stopped just a few feet from the grave and sat down. His head tilted to one side as he stared at the casket, his eyes filled with confusion and longing. What had happened to his owner? Why wasn't he here with the dog, like always? The dog's mouth opened, and he gave a single bark. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp and clear, cutting through the silence. The mourners turned their heads in surprise, looking at the dog with puzzled expressions. Some of the people gave the dog strange looks. They didn't understand why he had barked. It wasn't like him to make noise at a funeral, especially not in the middle of such a quiet moment. But the dog didn't care. He had to do it. He had to call out, to let everyone know that something was wrong, that something needed to be found. His eyes never left the grave, as if he expected something to happen, as if he was waiting for a sign. For a moment, there was complete silence again. The mourners continued to stare at the dog, unsure of what to make of his behavior. Then, slowly, one of the people stepped forward. It was an older man, his face lined with age and sorrow. He bent down slowly, his eyes meeting the dog's gaze. The dog looked back at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. There was no fear in the dog's eyes, only a deep desire to understand, to find out what had happened, and to make everything right. The man looked at the dog for a long moment, his wrinkled hands reaching down to pet him gently on the head. "Good boy," the man whispered, his voice soft and comforting. "What is it, boy? What do you need?" The dog licked the man's hand, but he didn't take his eyes off the grave. It was as if the dog could sense that something important was hidden there, something he needed to find. Without warning, the dog stood up and started to paw at the ground near the grave. His paws scraped against the earth, digging into the soft dirt. The mourners gasped, and some of them stepped back, unsure of what the dog was doing. The man who had spoken to the dog now took a step closer, his curiosity piqued. He didn't know what was happening, but he had a feeling that the dog knew something they didn't. The dog's digging became more frantic. His nose pressed into the dirt, his paws working furiously as he tried to uncover something buried deep beneath the earth. The mourners looked at each other in confusion. What was the dog trying to do? Why was he digging at the grave? The man bent down, kneeling beside the dog. He placed his hands on the dog's back, trying to calm him down. "It's okay, boy," he said softly. "What are you trying to tell us?" But the dog didn't stop. He kept digging, his paws pushing the dirt aside faster and faster. And then, with a sudden movement, he unearthed something. The dog's mouth grabbed hold of a small object, and he carefully pulled it from the dirt. The man gasped as he saw what the dog had uncovered. It was an old, withered envelope, its edges frayed and torn from years of being buried beneath the earth. The dog held the envelope gently in his mouth, his tail wagging slightly as if proud of his discovery. The man reached down carefully and took the envelope from the dog's mouth. He turned it over in his hands, examining it closely. It was clearly old, the paper yellowed with age and the ink faded, but there was something important about it. The man's heart raced. What could this letter possibly mean? The dog sat back on his haunches, watching the man closely as he held the envelope. It was as if the dog knew that this letter held the answers they had all been searching for. The mourners gathered around the man, their eyes wide with curiosity. "What is this?" one of them asked, her voice shaky. "What's in that letter?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he carefully opened the envelope, his fingers trembling slightly. He pulled out the letter inside and began to read it aloud, his voice shaking as he spoke the words. The dog sat quietly, his ears perked up as he listened to the letter's contents. The words seemed to speak to him directly, as if they were meant for him, as if the letter was a message that only he could understand. The dog didn't bark again. He didn't need to. He had done his part. The truth was now coming to light, and it was clear that the dog's actions had been the key to uncovering something much bigger than anyone had realized. The mourners stood silently, all eyes on the man as he read the letter. Some of them were in shock, some of them in disbelief. But the dog, with his calm presence and gentle eyes, seemed to know that everything was about to change. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the graveyard where the funeral had just ended. The mourners, dressed in dark clothing, were slowly beginning to gather their things and leave. It was a quiet scene, filled with the weight of sadness. The wind gently rustled the leaves on the trees, but otherwise, it was still. In the distance, the sound of birds calling out could be heard, a sharp contrast to the silence that had settled over the crowd. Among the mourners was a dog. His fur was a soft golden brown, his ears were slightly floppy, and his eyes looked big and round. He was an old dog, with wrinkles around his eyes and a slow, deliberate walk. The dog had been a constant companion to the man in the casket, his owner, who had passed away just a few days ago. The dog had stayed by his side through thick and thin. They had shared many years together, and now, in his final moments, the dog was here, standing silently at the edge of the crowd. The man's family had all gathered for the service, but the dog seemed out of place among them. He wasn't sure why everyone was so sad, but he felt it deep inside him. The man wasn't here anymore. That much was clear. But the dog didn't understand where he had gone. All he knew was that the man wasn't there to scratch behind his ears or throw his favorite ball. It felt like something was missing, and the dog's heart ached with that feeling. The dog stood still, his body tense as he watched the mourners say their final goodbyes. Some of them spoke softly to the casket, others wiped away tears, and some just stood silently, staring at the ground. The dog's eyes kept darting between them, trying to understand what was going on. He tilted his head slightly, as if hoping that one of them would explain it to him. But no one did. After a while, the dog began to move. He padded slowly forward, his paws making soft sounds on the gravel path as he walked toward the grave. The family didn't seem to notice him, too wrapped up in their grief. But the dog couldn't help it. He felt a pull in his heart, a need to be closer to his owner, even though he didn't quite understand what was happening. He reached the grave and stopped, looking down at the fresh mound of dirt. The dog's ears drooped, and he sniffed the ground, his nose brushing against the earth. There was something strange about the smell of the ground, like it wasn't just dirt, but something more. It made his nose twitch, and his curiosity grew. The dog took a step closer, sniffing more deeply, and then he barked once. It was a sharp sound, breaking the quiet, but it didn't seem to startle anyone. The mourners just glanced at him, a few people nodding sympathetically as if they understood the dog's confusion, but no one stopped to pay him much attention. The dog barked again, more urgently this time, his voice echoing through the graveyard. The mourners stopped talking and turned to look at him, surprised by the sudden noise. The dog's tail was held stiff, and his eyes were wide with excitement. It was as if he had sensed something that no one else could see. He took another step forward, his paws scraping against the soft dirt. The dog dug at the ground with his paws, trying to uncover whatever it was that had caught his attention. The ground was soft, and it didn't take long for the dog to uncover something hidden beneath the dirt. His paws scraped across something hard, and he stopped digging, his nose pressing down into the soil. Slowly, the dog pawed at the dirt to reveal an object, a small, weathered envelope. It was covered in dirt and grime, but the dog could still make out the faint shape of the envelope, with its edges frayed and torn. He picked it up with his mouth, his teeth gently gripping the paper, and pulled it out from the ground. The dog's tail wagged as he carefully trotted over to one of the mourners, a middle-aged woman who had been standing near the back of the crowd. She looked at him, her eyes wide with confusion, but when she saw the envelope in his mouth, her expression changed. The dog dropped the envelope at her feet, looking up at her with expectant eyes. It was as if he knew the letter was important, that it needed to be seen. The woman bit down slowly, her hands shaking as she picked up the letter. Her brow furrowed as she wiped the dirt off of it, revealing the faded handwriting on the front. The letter was addressed to the dog's owner, the man who had just been buried. She stood up and turned to the other mourners, holding the envelope out in front of her. I think this is for him," she said, her voice quiet but urgent. Some of the others gathered around her, their curiosity piqued by the sudden discovery. They watched as she carefully opened the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age. The handwriting was old-fashioned, with elegant loops and curves. It was clear that this letter had been written a long time ago. The woman read the letter aloud, her voice shaking as she spoke. To my dear friend. If you are reading this, then I am no longer with you. I leave you this letter to make a promise I should have kept long ago. The words on the page were filled with emotion, and the more the woman read, the more the room seemed to shift. The letter spoke of a deep secret, one that had been kept hidden for many years. It was clear that the man who had passed away had been involved in something the family knew nothing about. The letter described a promise the man had made, a promise that involved someone close to him, but the details were vague. The woman continued reading, her voice trembling more with each sentence. The words on the page described a situation the family had never expected. There was talk of a long-lost relative, someone who had been kept a secret for reasons that were not clear. The letter revealed that the man had made a promise to this person long ago, a promise that would now have to be fulfilled. The discovery was startling, leaving the family members stunned and confused. Who was this person? Why had the man kept this secret for so long? The dog sat quietly, watching the reaction of the mourners. He didn't understand what the letter meant, but he knew it was important. He had uncovered the secret, and now it was out in the open. His tail wagged slightly, as if he sensed that something had shifted, something had changed. He hadn't known that digging in the dirt would lead to such a discovery, but somehow, in that moment, he felt like he had done something right. The family members whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of the letter's contents. There were more questions than answers, and the emotions in the air were thick. Some people were angry, others were in shock, and a few even seemed afraid. The dog, however, remained calm, his eyes scanning the mourners as they gathered around the letter. He had done his part, and now it was up to the family to figure out what to do next. But one thing was clear, the discovery of the letter had changed everything. The dog had unknowingly unlocked a secret that had been buried for years. And as the mourners stood in the graveyard, surrounded by the quiet of the evening, they all knew that this moment, this unexpected discovery, would be something they would never forget. The dog had uncovered more than just a letter, he had uncovered a piece of the past that would forever alter the future. The mourners were standing quietly around the grave, their heads bent low in sadness. The sky above was cloudy, and the air felt heavy with the weight of loss. The dog, whose fur was a little matted from the days of grief, stood at the edge of the crowd, his tail hanging still and his eyes filled with confusion. He wasn't sure why everyone was so upset, but he knew something was wrong. His owner, the person he had spent so many years with, was no longer there. The man had always been kind to him. They had shared countless walks, games in the yard, and peaceful moments sitting together on the porch. But now, the man was gone, and all the dog could do was stand and watch as the mourners whispered among themselves. He didn't understand death or funerals, but he could feel the sadness in the air. His owner had always been there, and now, he wasn't. As the ceremony continued, something inside the dog began to stir. He walked slowly up to the grave, stepping carefully through the grass. The mourners glanced at him, but they didn't seem to notice the urgency in his steps. The dog paused at the foot of the casket, his nose twitching as he sniffed the ground. He didn't know what it was, but something was calling to him, something that made his instincts tell him to keep going. Then, the dog did something unexpected. He barked, a single loud bark that cut through the quiet air. It was a strange sound, one that made everyone stop and turn their heads. The dog barked again, his tail swishing nervously behind him. The mourners looked confused. They didn't understand why the dog was acting this way, and some of them even muttered, wondering if he was just upset, like any other pet would be after losing their owner. But the dog didn't stop. He continued barking, louder this time, his paws moving back and forth as if he was searching for something. His nose was buried in the earth, and his eyes were wide with determination. He was on a mission, and nothing could stop him. It didn't take long before one of the mourners stepped forward, a woman who had known the man for years. She bent down, placing a gentle hand on the dog's head. She spoke softly, trying to calm him down. "Shoo, it's okay," she whispered, but the dog didn't stop. His barking grew more insistent, and his digging became more frantic. The woman, puzzled and unsure of what to do, knelt beside him. "What is it, boy? What are you trying to tell me?" she asked. The dog ignored her question, his focus completely on the spot he was digging. He was determined to find something buried beneath the dirt. His claws scraped against the soil, and as the woman watched, she noticed that the ground seemed looser than usual. The dog's digging grew faster, his paws moving quickly in the dirt. It was as if he knew exactly what he was looking for. The woman stood up and stepped back, watching him in disbelief. She was beginning to feel that this wasn't just a random act of frustration from the dog. He was onto something. She had to find out what it was. And then, with one final push, the dog's paw hit something hard. The ground gave way, and a small, weathered envelope appeared in the dirt. The dog's eyes lit up. He nudged the envelope with his nose, as if to say, "Here it is." The woman froze, her heart racing. She had no idea how the dog had found this, but there it was, a hidden envelope, buried beneath the earth. It was old, yellowed with age, and it looked like it had been there for a very long time. The dog stepped back, watching as the woman knelt down again, her hands trembling as she picked up the envelope. It was light, almost delicate, and she could feel the importance of it even before opening it. She looked around, but no one else seemed to be moving. The dog, sensing that the moment had come, sat back on his haunches and waited. The woman turned the envelope over in her hands, seeing that it was sealed with an old wax seal. She carefully broke the seal and opened the flap. Inside was a piece of paper, folded neatly, its edges worn from years of handling. She pulled the paper out slowly, her eyes narrowing as she read the handwriting. It was unmistakable. This letter had been written by the man who had just been buried. It was addressed to him, and it had been meant for his eyes only. She took a deep breath and began to read aloud, her voice shaking with the weight of what was coming. "To my dearest friend," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then I am no longer with you. There are things I have kept hidden for many years, and now, as I near the end of my life, it is time for these secrets to be revealed." The mourners, who had been standing in silence, now turned to listen. The dog sat quietly, his eyes locked on the woman as she read the letter. No one could have known what this letter would reveal, but they could all feel that something important was happening. The woman continued reading, her voice becoming softer as she reached the next part. "I have kept these secrets for you, not out of malice, but out of love. There is someone I have loved for many years, someone I promised to protect. But circumstances have kept us apart. And now, I am asking you to find them." The letter went on to speak of a secret relationship that the man had kept hidden for years. It spoke of a promise made to a family member, someone who had been lost to time and circumstance. The letter revealed that the dog's owner had been holding on to something that could change everything, a secret that, once uncovered, would alter the course of the family's history. As the woman finished reading, the room was filled with an uneasy silence. The mourners looked at each other, unsure of what to say or do. The dog, who had been the one to bring this letter to light, remained still, as if he knew that he had played a crucial role in this discovery. His barking had been the key to unlocking a truth that had been hidden for far too long. The woman, still holding the letter in her hands, stood up and looked around at the others. This changes everything," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "This was meant to be found." The dog's tail flicked slightly as he watched the scene unfold. He didn't understand all the words, but he could feel the shift in the air. He had done his part, and now it was up to the others to understand what had just been uncovered. And as the mourners began to process the new information, they realized that the dog had played a pivotal role in bringing the hidden truth to light. His instinct had led him to that letter, buried deep beneath the grave, and now it was up to them to face the truth that had been hidden for so many years. The dog, despite his own grief, had become the hero of this story. The letter was passed from one person to another, each person in the circle staring at it with wide eyes. It had been hidden for so long, buried in the dirt next to the grave, but now that it had been found, it seemed like the weight of its contents was too much to bear. The dog sat quietly by the grave, his ears perked up, as if he understood the importance of what was unfolding. His tail wagged slowly, almost as if he was waiting for everyone to realize what he already knew. The man holding the letter took a deep breath and started to read it aloud. His voice trembled as he read the first few words, and the others in the circle leaned in closer, straining to hear. The letter was written in careful, neat handwriting, but the paper was yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded as if it had been sealed away for years. "Dearest Robert," the man began, his voice quiet at first. "If you are reading this, it means I have long since passed. I am writing to you because there is something you must know. Something that I have kept hidden from you for far too long, and I cannot let it go with me into the grave." The people around him exchanged nervous glances. They had known Robert well, and many of them couldn't imagine what kind of secret could have been hidden from him. The dog, who had once been Robert's loyal companion, gave a small whimper and shifted his position slightly. He had already done his part, finding the letter and bringing it to light, but now it was up to the humans to understand what it all meant. The man continued to read, his voice growing steadier as he went on. "There is someone you don't know. Someone who has been a part of our family for a long time, but I kept them hidden from you for reasons I thought were right at the time. But I see now that the time has come to reveal the truth. The person I'm speaking of is your sister." There was a sharp intake of breath from the group. Robert's sister? No one had ever mentioned her before. The family had always believed that Robert was an only child. The dog's ears pricked up, and he let out a soft bark, as if he too was shocked by this revelation. The man reading the letter paused, clearly shaken by the words he had just spoken. He glanced around at the others, who were now watching him intently. "I know this is difficult to believe," he said, his voice shaky. "But Robert's sister was never allowed to be part of his life. She was kept away from him, hidden from the family, and raised in secret. There are things I did, things I thought were necessary at the time, but I was wrong." The room fell silent as everyone tried to process what they had just heard. Robert, the man at the center of it all, was standing still, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. His hands shook as he reached out for the letter, wanting to read the next part for himself. But the man reading it to him continued, his voice growing more solemn. "The reasons for keeping her hidden were complicated. It was not because I didn't love her. I did, more than anything. But she was born under circumstances that made it impossible for me to raise her openly. It was a decision I made, and one I regret deeply now. I hope, one day, you will understand why I did it. And I hope you will find a way to forgive me." The words hung heavy in the air, and the group of mourners struggled to find something to say. How could they respond to this revelation? How could they even begin to understand the reasons behind such a difficult secret? The dog, sensing the change in mood, stood up and moved closer to the group, his eyes searching their faces. He had been part of this family for so long, and he knew the people here. He had seen the love and the pain, the happiness and the sorrow. But even he couldn't understand how this secret could have been kept for so many years. The man reading the letter turned the page slowly, as if he were dreading what came next. I want you to know that your sister is alive. She is out there, living her life, and I have kept track of her over the years. She has grown up to be a strong, kind person. I only hope that, when the time is right, you can find her and welcome her into your life. She is your sister, and you deserve to know her. A gasp rippled through the group. The dog stood completely still, his eyes locked on the man reading the letter. Robert's sister was alive? She had been out there, somewhere, all this time, and no one had known. The shock of it all seemed to hang in the air like a heavy fog, making it hard to breathe. The man reading the letter cleared his throat and continued. I don't expect forgiveness right away. I know this will take time. But I beg you, Robert, please don't let my mistakes keep you from knowing your sister. Find her. Tell her the truth, and let her be a part of your life. I hope, in time, you can build the relationship that was taken from you both. I hope you can understand why I did what I did. But above all, I hope you can forgive me, and that you can find peace. The man finished reading the letter and fell silent, still holding it in his hands. The room was still, the only sound the soft rustle of the wind outside. The dog stood next to Robert, his head tilted, as if waiting for something to happen. Robert's face was pale, his eyes wide as he processed the words. His hands gripped the letter tightly, as if he were afraid to let go of it, afraid that the truth would slip away if he did. For a moment, no one spoke. Everyone seemed lost in their own thoughts, trying to understand what had just been revealed. The dog's tail wagged slowly, but he didn't bark or whine. He just stood there, waiting, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice hoarse. My sister. I have a sister. He looked around at the people gathered there, his eyes filled with confusion and disbelief. How could this have been kept from me for so long? Why didn't anyone tell me? The man who had been reading the letter took a step forward, placing a hand gently on Robert's shoulder. We didn't know how to tell you, he said softly. We didn't understand why it had been kept from you either. But now, we know. And we need to find her. We need to make this right. Robert nodded slowly, his mind racing. He had never even imagined such a thing. The idea of a sister, a person who had been out there all this time, was both exciting and overwhelming. He didn't know where to begin, but he knew one thing for sure, he had to find her. He had to meet the sister he never knew he had. The dog, sensing Robert's inner turmoil, sat down next to him and rested his head on Robert's knee. It was as if he understood the weight of the moment, the overwhelming flood of emotions that was taking over Robert's heart. The dog had been by Robert's side through so much already, and now, he was there to offer comfort, as if saying, I'm here. We'll get through this together. As Robert stroked the dog's fur, he took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew he had a purpose now. He had a sister to find. And the truth that had been hidden from him for so long, was finally out in the open. The room felt thick with emotions as the letter was read aloud. People looked at each other in shock, some with their mouths open, others just staring at the piece of paper like it was some kind of magical thing that could change everything. The dog, sitting quietly in the middle of the room, seemed to sense the change in the air. His head was held high, his eyes soft but steady, as if he knew something everyone else didn't. The mourners around him were reacting to the letter, but he didn't need to understand all the words on the paper. He already knew that something big was happening. As the person reading the letter finished, silence fell over the crowd. It was like the world had stopped moving for a second, and no one knew what to say next. The letter had revealed things no one had expected. It wasn't just a letter full of memories or simple notes about a life well lived. No, it was much more than that. It was a letter filled with a secret that had been buried for years, hidden away from everyone who thought they knew everything about the person they had just buried. The letter spoke about a promise that had never been kept, about a part of the deceased person's life that no one had ever known about. It was about a secret love, a relationship that had been hidden from everyone in the family. The letter explained that, many years ago, the deceased had made a promise to someone they loved deeply. But this promise, this secret, had never been shared with anyone, not even the closest family members. The letter mentioned a person, a name no one in the room had ever heard before, and it described a life lived in the shadows of a family secret. As the reader finished, the letter was passed around. Each person looked at it with disbelief, trying to wrap their minds around what they had just heard. The dog, who had led them to this discovery, seemed to understand the importance of the moment. He looked up at each of the people in the room with a gaze that seemed to say, "I knew something was hidden." The dog's ears were perked up, his tail wagging slightly as if he was proud of himself for playing a part in this huge reveal. His barks earlier, loud and insistent, had not just been random sounds, they had been the key that opened a door to a secret no one knew about. The dog had uncovered something that would change everything. The shock of the letter's contents hit the family members hard. Faces turned pale, and eyes filled with tears as they realized the depth of the hidden truth. For some, it felt like betrayal. For others, it was confusion. How could they not have known this part of the deceased person's life? How could someone they loved so much have kept this secret for so long? The truth was painful, and it stirred up old emotions that no one was prepared to face at such a time. The room was filled with murmurs and hushed conversations. Some people started to argue quietly, trying to make sense of what the letter meant for their family. Some questioned whether they could even trust the words written on the old paper. Had the deceased person really kept such an important part of their life hidden for so many years? Had the secret been kept out of love, or was it something darker? The questions piled up, and no one had answers. The letter had opened a door to more confusion, and for many, the truth felt harder to accept than the grief they had just been experiencing. But through all the chaos, there was one constant: the dog. He didn't seem bothered by the confusion around him. In fact, he seemed calm, even wise in a way, as if he had known this day would come. The dog sat still, watching his human family members with an understanding gaze. He didn't need to know all the details to understand that his actions had played an important role in revealing the truth. He had been the one to uncover the letter, to bring the hidden secrets to light. Despite all the shock and disbelief around him, the dog remained steady, like he was the one with the answers. His presence in the room became a symbol of the truth that had come to light. In some strange way, it felt like the dog had always been part of this mystery, even if he didn't fully understand it himself. Maybe it was his loyalty to the deceased person, or maybe it was simply his instinct to protect and help that had led him to the grave where the letter was hidden. But now, he knew his part was done. The dog's calmness in the face of all the confusion made it clear that he was not just a pet. He was part of the family, part of the story, and his role in uncovering the truth was undeniable. Without him, the letter would never have been found. Without his barks and his digging, the secrets would have stayed buried. The dog had given the family a chance to know the truth, to understand the part of their loved one's life that had remained hidden for so long. And now, they had to face that truth. As the mourners continued to talk, some trying to comfort one another, others still too stunned to speak, the dog stayed close to the group. He didn't move. His gaze never wavered, his eyes fixed on the people around him, as if to say, "I've done my part. Now, it's up to you." The room had changed. It wasn't just a place of mourning anymore, it had become a place of revelation. The truth had been uncovered, and now, everyone had to figure out what it meant for their lives, their family, and their future. Some of the family members started to sit down, looking defeated. They didn't know how to move forward with all this new information. Others seemed to be searching for answers in the letter, as if it held the key to understanding the person they had just lost. The letter had made everything so much more complicated. It wasn't just about grieving anymore, it was about reconciling with a past they hadn't known about. It was about understanding the choices the deceased person had made, and the reasons behind the secrets they had kept. For the dog, it didn't matter what the family members decided to do with the truth. He had done what he had been meant to do. His loyalty, his sense of duty, had driven him to bark and dig until he uncovered the letter. And now, he was content. He sat beside the mourners, his head resting on his paws, his eyes soft and understanding. The grief was still there, but the mystery had been solved. The family could move forward, knowing that the truth, no matter how painful, had been revealed. The dog's quiet strength and unwavering loyalty became the emotional center of the room. His role in uncovering the letter made him more than just a pet, it made him a hero in the eyes of the family. Without him, the secret would have stayed hidden, and the family would have continued to live in ignorance. But thanks to the dog's actions, the family now had the chance to heal, to understand, and to move forward. It was a hard truth, but it was the truth, and in the end, that was what mattered most. As the mourners continued to process the letter's contents, they looked at the dog with a new sense of respect. He had been the one to bring them the truth. His bark had started it all, and now they would have to deal with the consequences. It wasn't easy, but the dog had shown them that sometimes the truth had to come to light, no matter how hard it might be to face. The dog sat quietly in the middle of the group, his eyes looking from one person to the next. There was a strange calmness about him, something that felt different now. Just moments ago, he had been barking loudly, digging furiously in the dirt as if he knew there was something hidden beneath the surface. When he pulled the old letter from the ground, the world around him had changed. Now, as the letter was read aloud, everyone's emotions were all over the place. Some people were shocked, others were angry, and a few were crying. But the dog remained still, his head tilted slightly, as if he understood that his actions had caused something important to happen. His bark, loud and strong, had been the start of everything. It was almost as if he had known all along that this letter held something big, something that needed to be known. As the letter was read out loud, everyone was learning a secret that had been hidden for years. They had no idea that the person they had lost had kept such an important part of their life a secret. And the dog, just a simple creature with loyalty and instinct, had brought it to light. He had no way of knowing the exact contents of the letter, but it was as if he sensed its importance from the very beginning. The dog's eyes moved from one mourner to the next. Some of them seemed confused, not knowing how to react to what they were hearing. Others, however, looked angry, almost as if they couldn't believe what was being revealed. But through it all, the dog remained calm. His loyalty to the one who had passed away was unwavering. His actions hadn't been about getting attention or showing off, his instincts had simply guided him to do something that would lead to a powerful change. People looked at the dog differently now. They had always known him as a loyal companion, but now he felt almost like a hero. He had uncovered something that no one else had been able to find, something that would change everything. It wasn't about being a big, strong dog or doing something that would make him famous. It was about doing what he knew needed to be done. His actions weren't for glory, but out of love and loyalty. One of the mourners, a woman who had been close to the deceased, walked over and knelt down beside the dog. Her face was soft with emotion, and she gently placed her hand on his head. "You did the right thing, boy," she whispered, her voice shaky with tears. The dog looked up at her, his eyes gentle and kind, as if he understood her words. His tail gave a small, slow wag, as if he was trying to comfort her, too. The people around him were still talking, still processing everything that had come to light. But the dog didn't mind. He wasn't focused on the reactions of the people around him. He was simply sitting there, doing what he knew he had to do. His job was finished now. He had uncovered the letter, and the truth was out. Whatever happened next was beyond his control. His mind drifted back to the moment when he first started barking. At the time, he hadn't known exactly what was buried in the ground. He had only felt a strange pull, a need to dig and uncover something hidden. He had trusted his instincts, and those instincts had led him to the letter. It was almost as if he had known that it wasn't just a letter, it was the key to unlocking something important. The dog's body felt tired, but he didn't move. He stayed where he was, his eyes locked on the faces around him. It was as if he was trying to read the people's emotions, trying to understand how they felt about what he had done. Some seemed grateful, some confused, and others were lost in their own thoughts. The dog didn't understand everything that was going on, but he knew that he had played a part in something bigger than himself. As the minutes passed, the energy around the grave began to shift. The angry voices quieted, and the confused faces started to soften. People began to realize that the letter wasn't just a secret, it was a truth that needed to be heard. The dog's actions had forced everyone to confront something they hadn't been ready for. It was hard, it was painful, but it was also something that couldn't be ignored any longer. In that moment, the dog's presence was more than just a comfort, it was a reminder of the power of loyalty and love. He hadn't known the full weight of what he was doing, but his actions had sparked a change. A change that would affect everyone standing there. The dog had done what needed to be done, and now it was up to the people to decide what to do with the truth he had uncovered. As the mourners slowly began to leave the grave, their faces were filled with a mix of emotions. Some were still trying to process what they had learned, while others seemed to be thinking about how to move forward. The dog remained sitting by the grave, watching them as they walked away. He had done his job. He had brought the truth to the surface, and now he could rest. The woman who had patted his head earlier came back to him. She knelt down beside the dog once more, her face full of gratitude and sadness. "Thank you, boy," she said, her voice full of emotion. "You did what we couldn't. You gave us a chance to make things right." The dog looked up at her, his eyes soft. He didn't fully understand the weight of her words, but he knew that she was thankful. His tail gave a small, quiet wag, and he nudged her gently with his nose. It was a small gesture, but it was his way of showing that he was there, always loyal, always present. The woman smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "You're a good boy," she whispered, as she stood up and turned to leave. The dog watched her go, feeling a quiet sense of peace. He had done what he was meant to do. His owner's secret had been revealed, and now the healing could begin. As the last of the mourners walked away, the dog stood up slowly, his old body creaking with the effort. He took one last look at the grave, then turned and walked away, his steps slow but steady. He had uncovered the truth, and now it was time for him to find his own peace. The truth had changed everything, but the dog had done his part. And that, in the end, was all he had needed to do. The sun began to set as the last of the mourners slowly started to leave the graveyard. A quiet, peaceful stillness settled over the place, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the trees. The dog, who had been at the center of everything, sat by the grave, looking at the spot where his owner had been buried. His eyes were filled with sadness, but there was also a quiet sense of peace. All around him, people were talking in hushed tones. Some of them were wiping away tears, while others were still trying to understand what had just happened. The letter had changed everything. The discovery had been unexpected, and no one had imagined the secret that was hiding inside it. The truth was out now, and everyone was processing it in their own way. But the dog didn't need to understand all the details. He didn't know everything that had happened, but he knew one thing for sure: his owner was gone, and this letter had brought everything into the open. It had been his bark that had led them to it, his digging and curiosity that had unlocked the mystery. The dog sat still, his tail gently swishing back and forth. He had been a part of something much bigger than he realized. In the days before, when his owner had still been alive, the dog had never known about the secrets hidden in that letter. But now, as he sat next to the grave, the truth had come to light, and he could feel the weight of it. The family was changing, and the world around him seemed different too. For a moment, everything felt still. The family members who had been so angry and confused just moments before were now beginning to talk to each other more calmly. They weren't shouting anymore, and they weren't upset. Instead, they were sitting together in small groups, quietly discussing the letter, sharing their thoughts, and trying to figure out what this secret meant for their future. The dog's presence seemed to bring some comfort. He was still there, sitting quietly beside the grave, like he had done before. His fur was ruffled from digging, and his eyes were sad, but there was a calmness about him that no one could ignore. Even the youngest of the family members, who had been crying just moments ago, now seemed to find some peace just by being near him. As the family members slowly made their way back to the car, talking in soft voices, the dog stood up. He looked one last time at the grave, his tail wagging gently. He hadn't understood everything that had happened today, but he knew that his owner's spirit was still with them. The family might never be the same again, but they would carry on. They would learn to accept the truth, and they would find a way to heal. With one final glance at the grave, the dog turned and walked toward the gate. He walked slowly, his steps steady but purposeful. He knew where he was going. He was going home. As he left the graveyard behind, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. His owner was gone, but the love they had shared was not. It wasn't just in the memories or the way they had cared for each other. The love was also in the way the family had come together in the wake of the secret. Despite all the confusion and the pain, they had found a way to unite, to understand each other, and to begin the process of healing. The dog had always been there for his owner. He had been the loyal companion, the one who would sit by their side no matter what. And now, in this strange twist of fate, he had become the one to help bring the truth to light. His bark had uncovered the letter, and in doing so, he had played a crucial role in changing everything for the family. As the dog walked through the streets, the world around him seemed a little brighter. The sky above him was a soft shade of orange, the fading light of the day giving everything a warm, golden glow. He didn't know what the future held, but he felt ready to face it. When he arrived back at his home, he walked inside and lay down in his favorite spot by the door. He was tired, but it was a good kind of tired. He had done his part, and now it was time to rest. His owner might be gone, but he was still here. And he had a feeling that things would be okay. The family would find a way to heal. They would learn to accept the truth, and in time, they would remember the good things about their loved one. They would carry on, just as his owner had wanted. The dog had no doubt about that. As the night grew darker, the dog closed his eyes. He wasn't alone. He could still feel the love of his owner, and he could feel the love of the family, even though it had been hidden for so long. And for the first time in a long time, he felt that everything would be all right. He didn't need to understand all the complexities of human relationships. He didn't need to know everything about the secrets or the mysteries. All he knew was that he had loved, and he had been loved in return. That was enough. And with that, the dog drifted off to sleep, his mind at peace, knowing that his owner's legacy would live on, not just in the family's memories, but in the way they had come together after the truth had been revealed. The end was just the beginning of a new chapter. The dog had played his part, and now, as he lay there, he knew that he had helped guide the family to a better place. There was still healing to be done, but the first steps had been taken, and that was enough for now. Tomorrow would come, and the family would face it together, stronger and more united than before. The dog's final bark had been a call for the truth to be revealed, and in the end, it had brought everything into the light. The dog's loyalty and love had been the catalyst, and that made him feel proud. He had been a hero in his own quiet way. The dog, now sitting quietly in the center of the graveyard, looked up at the sky. The clouds above seemed heavy with all the unspoken words that had been brought to light. His tail was still, and his fur ruffled slightly in the soft wind that whispered through the trees. It was as if the world around him had shifted, as if everything had changed in that one moment when he had unearthed the letter. The family gathered around him, still processing the discovery. Their faces were a mix of emotions: shock, disbelief, confusion, and something else, something deeper that no one could quite put into words. They had just learned about a secret their beloved family member had kept for years. The letter had told them things about their past, about their family's history, that they never could have imagined. The dog's eyes scanned the faces of the people around him. He had always known something was wrong. He had always felt that there was something hidden, something important that no one was talking about. His bark had been the key to opening that door. And now, as the family tried to process the truth, the dog couldn't help but wonder if he had done the right thing. Had he opened a door that was better left closed? The mourners were starting to gather their thoughts. Some were crying, others were speaking in low voices, trying to understand what had just been revealed. The letter had described a long-lost family member, someone who had been part of the family years ago, but had been forgotten. It also mentioned a promise that had never been fulfilled. A promise that had been buried deep in the past, hidden away in the shadows. No one knew about this person or the promise, but now it was out in the open. And the family had to figure out what to do with this new information. The dog tilted his head, looking at the group with soft eyes. He couldn't understand the full weight of what the letter had revealed. He didn't know what the promise meant or who the lost family member was. All he knew was that he had found something important, something that needed to be seen, something that had to be shared. He had done his part. But now, he watched as the family began to unravel the mystery. One of the family members, a woman in her late 30s, stepped forward. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled as she reached out to the dog. She crouched down, gently stroking his fur, her voice shaky. "You did the right thing," she whispered to him. "You gave us the truth we didn't know we needed." The dog looked up at her, his eyes full of loyalty. He didn't bark, didn't wag his tail. He just sat there, silent and still. He wasn't sure what the woman meant, but he could feel the comfort in her words. She wasn't angry at him. She wasn't upset. She was thankful. And that made him feel a little better. He had been unsure at first. He had barked out of instinct, not knowing what would happen, but now he saw that the family was beginning to understand. The woman stood up and turned to the rest of the family. "We have to find this person," she said. "We have to find out who they are and what this promise was about." Her voice was steady now, though there was still a sense of sadness in her tone. "We can't leave this unfinished. We need answers." One of the men in the group nodded. "But where do we even start?" he asked. "How do we find someone who's been gone for so long?" The woman's eyes narrowed in thought. "There must be something in the letter," she said. "Some clue, some name, something that can point us in the right direction." The dog, still sitting at their feet, perked up his ears. He hadn't understood everything, but he could sense the urgency in the air. The family had to find this person. They had to complete what had been left undone. And the dog wanted to help. He didn't know how, but he wanted to be a part of it. He had uncovered the letter, and now it was time for the family to finish what he had started. The group gathered around the letter, reading it again and again, looking for any detail they might have missed the first time. They searched for names, dates, locations, anything that could lead them to the lost family member. The woman who had first spoken up turned to the dog and smiled. "We're going to need your help," she said softly. "We'll need you to guide us." The dog tilted his head, unsure of what she meant. But something in her voice told him that she believed in him. She trusted him. And that made him feel proud. He had done his part already by finding the letter. Now, he would stand by the family as they searched for the rest of the answers. Hours passed as the family searched through old papers, photographs, and documents. The dog stayed close by, watching as they worked, always alert, always present. He could sense the growing frustration in the air. The family had so many questions, but no clear answers. The letter had given them a small clue, but it was far from enough. They needed more. As the sun began to set, the woman who had first spoken up came to a sudden realization. She picked up an old photograph from the table. It was a picture of the deceased family member, taken years ago. In the background, there was a small, crumbling building, an old cabin in the woods. The woman's eyes widened. "This is it," she exclaimed. "This is where we start." The dog stood up and barked excitedly. He knew this was important. He didn't know why, but something in his gut told him this was the right path. He wagged his tail, eager to get moving. The family needed to find the cabin. They needed to see if this was the place that held the answers to their questions. The group quickly gathered their things and set off toward the cabin. The dog led the way, his nose sniffing the air, his body tense with excitement. He had found the letter, and now he was determined to help the family find the truth that lay hidden within the walls of the cabin. The journey was long, and the night was cold, but the dog didn't stop. He kept moving, leading the family through the dense forest, his senses guiding him forward. The family followed, unsure of what they would find, but determined to uncover the truth. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, they reached the cabin. It was old and run down, its wooden walls covered in vines, the windows dark and empty. The door creaked as the woman pushed it open, and the family stepped inside, the air musty and heavy with dust. The dog's ears perked up as he entered the cabin. There was something familiar about this place, something that made him feel both nervous and excited. He walked around the room, sniffing every corner, every crack in the floor. And then, as if by instinct, he stopped in front of a dusty old chest in the corner. The family gathered around him, unsure of what to do next. The woman bent down to open the chest, her hands shaking with anticipation. Inside, there were more letters, more photographs, and a small, worn box. She opened the box, and inside was a ring, a simple gold ring, with a small inscription that read, "To my love, forever." Tears filled her eyes as she held the ring in her hand. She understood now. The promise that had been made so many years ago was a promise of love. A promise that had been broken. But now, in this moment, the family could begin to heal. The truth had been revealed, and it was all thanks to the dog who had barked during the funeral and uncovered the hidden letter. The dog stood by their side, his tail wagging gently as the family came to terms with the truth. He had done his part. And now, as the family embraced each other, he knew that his loyalty and instinct had helped them find the answers they had been searching for. The mystery had been solved. The family had found the closure they needed, and the dog had found a sense of peace. It was time to go home.